Senator Galloway was buried in Pine Forest, but sadly his grave marker has disappeared. The author says when Senator Galloway would make speeches, Frederick Douglass, the famed orator and civil rights advocate, often introduced him. Last weekend marked Senator Galloway's 188th birthday. Joining us now for more on his legacy are two current state lawmakers, Representative Brian Echeverria, Republican from Cabarrus County. His legacy is important still today, right?
It's super important to me. You know, what's interesting is when I hear his story as one of the first black legislators in North Carolina and hear about his bravery, I think we all have inside of us the willingness to fight for our own freedom, but his willingness to sacrifice it all, lay it down again for the freedom of others is probably the thing that moved me the most.
I watched you while we were doing this, and you were nodding your head and laughing about some of the stuff that he did. It sounded like he was quite a character.
Yes.
And there's been plenty of those in our time. What do you think stood out to you about that story you just saw and about him?
The willingness to come back. I mean, the willingness to come back is probably the most impressive thing, because that's the selfless act. He was free in the North. He doesn't just come back as a spy. He actually comes back and he fights for the rights of the people who are now free and works his way into the legislative branch. And for me, it's really important because here's a fun trivia question. In another 30 years, I'm the first black man to represent Cabarrus County in the state legislature. I didn't realize that until Black History Month started to approach. Right, you start to look into things and hearing.
Do you feel responsibility with that?
Yeah, not an additional responsibility. I love people, man. I mean, I think that people are amazing. God loves people, and every single person, even my colleagues who are across the aisle, I mean, they're unique, you know. And so I didn't need anything to say, hey, man, let's do right by people. So I don't feel an extra responsibility, but I could tell you that my family, the way it's built, I come from a very diverse family. Like, everybody reminds me of someone that I love already. And for me, that really works out in the legislature.
And how, you know, we are in a different era of politics today in a lot of ways. I mean, there were problems back then, there were problems in the 60s, and now's a really partisan kind of era.
Yes.
You know, there's talk of DEI and all this other stuff going on. How do you feel about that about how race is playing a role in politics today?
Man, I think, how about we not discriminate ever, right? You know, that for me, when I think about what we've overcome as a nation, whether you're talking Rosewood, Axe Handle Day down in Jacksonville, slavery, civil rights abuses, we've gone through a lot and remedied a lot to get here today, for me to sit in this seat. So now looking forward, how do we make sure that none of those things repeat itself against anyone, right? So I think when you talk about DEI, I'm like, hey, how about no one? You don't discriminate against anyone. And let's try that on for a generation. What's interesting is my daughter, her children will be the first generation in U.S. history to not know or love someone who perpetuated or suffered slavery or civil rights abuses. They are the clean slate generation. Everything we've gone through is going to be a story in a history book. And I do feel a responsibility on behalf of all of those children to make sure that it remains just a story in a history book.
Hold up, hold up.